January Blue Trails Guide webinar. My name is Faye Augustin, and I'm the Associate Director for Colorado River Basin Programs with American Rivers. I'm really excited and pleased to have all of you join us today as we learn about building partnerships for source water protection with our presenter, Bob Morgan. So as a reminder, we'll go through a few technical support pieces before we get started. If your connection is lost at all during the webinar, please feel free to log in again using your unique web link and passcode that was provided to you when you registered with GoToWebinar. Additionally, there is a 3 to 5 second delay moving from one slide to the other, so just remember that as you're participating and listening to the webinar if things seem a little bit slow. As always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on February 10th at the latest for viewing at bluetrailsguide.org/blog. If you have any questions regarding the webinar or future webinars, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on the bottom of the screen. So as a part of our webinar series, we encourage lots of questions and answers. And so we leave about 5 minutes at the end of the 30-minute webinar to answer as many questions as we can. I encourage you throughout the webinar to answer or to ask questions in the question box, which is on the right-hand side panel of your GoToWebinar box. You can ask questions throughout the webinar or you can ask them at the end. But we'd love for you to be involved, and Bob is really excited to answer your questions. So without further ado, I am excited to introduce Bob Morgan, who is currently the Program Manager for Arkansas's Forestry and Drinking Water Collaboration. Dr. Morgan recently retired as the Manager of Environmental Quality at the Beaver Water District. In that position, Dr. Morgan was responsible for management of the district's water quality lab and implementation of the source water protection program. In addition to his duties at the Water District, Dr. Morgan also served as an adjunct faculty at the Biological Engineering Department at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, where he taught courses related to hydrology. Previously, Dr. Morgan worked for the state of Arkansas Soil and Water Conservation Commission, where he developed and implemented the state's first non-point source pollution management program. He's an active member of the American Water Works Association, serving on the association's Technological and Educational Council. Dr. Morgan lives in Springdale, Arkansas with his wife, Sharon. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Bob. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Faye. I want to say that it really is a privilege to speak to the American Rivers group today, and I'm glad to do so because American Rivers has a real good reputation around the country. And like Faye said, I am just recently retired from Beaver Water District, so if you hear me speaking of we, it's probably referring to Beaver Water District instead of me and someone else. So that's just some information. Just jumping on in, there are a lot of reasons for a water utility and a conservation group to want to collaborate. And what I want to do today is talk about what those benefits are to both groups and how we as utilities and or conservation groups might make a collaboration happen. So let's just jump in here and look at where we're going. For the benefit of those of you that are not representatives of water utilities, I want to describe what a water utility is, what they do, where they get their funding. Then I want to talk about why they might be interested in a healthy watershed or working in the conservation field. Look at some of the reasons that utilities and conservation groups are not currently collaborating. And then using Beaver Water District as my example, because I know that one best, look at some examples of successful collaboration with conservation groups. And finally wrap up with just a few ideas of how to make it happen. So thinking about what a typical water utility is, the simple answer is there's not one. We can look at them. Many of them are public. In other words, they're owned by the people within their service area. and some of them are private, such as American Water, which has a lot of utility interests in cities and areas around the country. Some utilities might be a city department, those that are public. In other words, they report to the mayor directly. Some of them may be independent. They might have an independent water commission. That commission might be appointed by the mayor, or it might be elected by the people. So there's a variety of makeups of water utilities. Some of them may serve water just to a pretty restricted area, their local municipality, or even some areas part of a municipality. Others, and Beaver Water District falls into this realm, might be regional, serving water to a multi-county area, a larger area than just municipality. There are a few occurrences across the country of where a state or a federal agency might run a water utility. Typically that would be a state park or a federal park or a prison, something like that, a institution. And then when we look at what utilities do, some utilities just have a source of water that they can tap and treat and provide to other utilities to distribute. Some utilities have the source themselves, and they provide the treatment and the distribution. And some of them buy water from a supplier, and then all they really operate is the distribution system. So there's a variety of things that water utilities do as well. If we look at size, it runs from a few thousand gallons production per day in a small community to maybe a few billion gallons per day in the largest systems in the country. The one thing that maybe all utilities have in common is that our funding is entirely made up of the sale of water to customers. In other words, we're funded by our water rates or possibly meter fees. And just to look at a typical mission, or a mission statement anyway, it's probably not typical, but I think there's some typical things here, and this is Beaver's statement. And you look at that, and utilities are striving to meet their customers' needs. That's the water users within their distribution area. That's both in quantity and quality. We need to meet all regulations, and those regulations are set to protect public health. So if we don't meet regulations, then public health is at risk. And we also need to be economically priced, because water is a product that is used in lots of different parts of our economy, and it could have impact on the economy directly. So meet needs, meet requirements, control costs. And then how do we do that as a water utility? And at least the more progressive utilities that have sources of water and distribution systems use what are called multiple barriers. And that's just trying to find as many ways as possible to intervene between a source of pollution and a water consumer. That starts with getting the highest quality source of water that's available, protecting that source, the Source Water Protection Program, being prepared for emergencies, either man-made or natural, providing good water treatment, and that's the typical plant you see out at the edge of town, managing the distribution center, because just because water is clean when it leaves the treatment plant doesn't mean it's clean when it gets to your tap. Continuously monitoring that water against those regulations to make sure we are in compliance, and then educating the consumers of the water for several reasons. Number one is so they know where their water comes from, what the system is, but also so there are a set of eyes in the system looking at things that may be going wrong. And then when you look at that list of barriers and the interface between a utility and a conservation group, it's those first two barriers that we're really talking about. The best quality source available, which AWWA, the American Water Works Association, encourages utilities to find, and protecting those sources. What we find is that generally, and science tells us this, and common sense tells us this, the best source of water is going to be one that comes from a forested watershed, or at least one that is primarily a natural ecosystem, because there's fewer sources of pollution out there to impair the water quality as it goes along. So let's look at the source water protection as a program for just a minute. American Water Works also has a standard here for source water protection. It's G300, and it provides the elements, minimum elements for a source water protection program for a utility. That starts with having a vision of what you would like to see your source of water looking like. Then characterizing that water source in quality, quantity, potential sources of contamination, developing goals that you strive for that will help you meet your mission, then putting those goals into action through an action plan, actually implementing those actions, because nothing happens if you don't get out in the watershed and implement things. And then finally, since we're dealing in natural systems, we have to look at the results and make that feedback loop and go back to start all over again. It's adaptive management 101, basically. An important thing here, though, related to our conversation today, is that vision statement, those program goals, and the action plan should be developed by the water utility in coordination with the stakeholders who have interest in the quality of that water, or a reason to be interested in the watershed management efforts. Also, when you get to the action plan itself, since we are working with primarily non-point sources of pollution in a lot of cases, and water utilities really don't have authority to go out into their watershed and implement regulations and things. So we have to work with partners to get those action plans implemented on the ground. And that's where we really come into the need for collaborating with conservation groups, forester groups, and other people of that nature. Source water protection program, according to AWWA, is a program that maintains, safeguards, and/or improves the quality of a given source of water. And the AWWA has found a lot of benefits that are provided to the utility. The first one probably being those that have source water protection programs provide greater protection of the public health. Remember, when regulations are not met, then public health is at danger, so that this is an important part. We're more able to respond to the uncertainties that come with working in a natural system, and this would be uncertainties such as spills that might happen in the watershed, or things like that might happen in nature, like storms or droughts, earthquakes, tornadoes. Being ready to respond to that. Skip over avoiding costs for a second and look at that improved compliance. We like to say in utility business that 100% is the minimum compliance we can have, because otherwise health is endangered. Our customers may not actually know they expect us to do source water protection, but as soon as something happens, the utility people are the ones that they call. But getting to the nuts and bolts it really gets down to cost. So let's look at that for just a second. When you think about a source of water and then treating the water, it makes sense that clean water to start with is easier and less expensive to treat. It takes less chemicals, so forth. So there are lower costs there. The real cost savings, though, when you have a source water protection program, is by avoiding the cost of a non-compliance, which can be fairly significant in a community, or also if the potential for water quality to degrade exists, then you might be avoiding the cost of implementing more advanced treatment systems, which are more costly to operate. Then the AWWA looks at this and they find that those utilities that have source water protection programs typically get better bond ratings. In other words, they have more options on where they go out and look for funding for system expansions, system rehabilitations, things like that. So that gives them an incentive to look at source water protection. And finally, most important to those of us here today is the funding opportunities that arise. Most of the federal grant programs today are making protecting the drinking water a priority in their selection of grants. So by partnering with a water utility, you automatically move yourself up on the list of people that are likely to get funded. And also those people that have a plan in place that shows where they're trying to go with the project they're proposing are also looked at more favorably by funding agencies. So there's a lot of business type cases to look at. So let's think about a source water protection program, and I just have an example of Beaver Water District's plan sitting there. Some critical things to think about there is this is long-term, as conservation projects are. Our plan is written for 50 years. That doesn't mean it's done in 50 years. That just means we're always looking 50 years in the future. It involves, in our case, since we deal with a lot of non-point sources of pollution or potential sources of contamination, landscape management, conservation practices, things like that. But as a utility, we have the limited authority to get out into our watershed and work. Therefore, the collaboration is part of the source water protection plan. We have to get to the people that can help us get to the people that can make a difference. And the last thing to think about, it's not a cheap way of getting to clean water. It's pretty expensive. Our plan, if we implement it all, is going to cost somewhere above $300 million over the 50 years, and then it keeps going. So it's not an inexpensive thing. A lot of the plan, like I said, is looking at landscape management. We're trying to maintain that natural infrastructure in the watershed. That would be the things like the lakes, the streams, riparian vegetations, the forests, the wetlands, and that infrastructure provides us with services referred to as ecosystem services or watershed services, and those would be a supply of water that's relatively constant both in quantity and quality. The flow doesn't peak during big storms and go to nothing during droughts, so it's more easily treated. The natural infrastructure does provide for abatement of pollution if the pollution does happen within the watershed, but also it typically just moves sources of contamination farther away from the streams and the water sources and makes it more difficult for the contamination to get into the water. Generally, when you look at watersheds and land uses, the natural infrastructure is going to provide the best water quality related to water treatment, and that's when compared to agriculture or urban uses or construction uses, things like that. So it's really a benefit to have the natural infrastructure, which also relates to the conservation practices and needs. To get it, really bring it out, if you look at this slide, the pie graph is the land use in the Beaver Lake watershed, the Beaver Water District source of water. The dark green is the percentage of land that's in forest. And then if you go over and look at the column graphs on the right side of the screen, you see that little thin green slice on top. That's the percentage, in this case, of total phosphorus that comes from that 60% of forest. It's about 4% of the total phosphorus load into the lake. The same would be true if we looked at sediment, nitrogen, and many other pollutants. The forest or the natural infrastructure provides just a little bit of the pollutant that we have to deal with, and that emphasizes the need to maintain that structure. Also, when we look at the benefit of facilities, the benefit to cost ratio, in this slide, in our analysis, we did a triple bottom line analysis of our source water program. Conserving existing forest and existing pasture are the most cost-effective practices that we can implement. In effect, $7.6 comes back for every dollar we spent on conserving existing forests. A lot of that does go to the environmental benefits, but even if we just look at Beaver Water District by itself, we get a significant return on our investment over 50 years by implementing those practices. That kind of brings up this idea of payment for ecosystem services or payment for watershed services. Water utilities and other people who utilize water or things from the environment receive value. In our case, in water utility, we receive clean water that's easier and safer to treat. We have reduced risk of contamination. We probably have some financial savings to look at. On the other side of that, the provider of those services, of course, that is the ecosystem, but the people that own that ecosystem, the landowners, have costs in maintaining that forest or that riparian buffer. And that cost may be direct, or it might be a cost of not being able to do something else on their land. So they have real costs. And that kind of implies that those people that have the benefit might want to consider providing those people that have the cost with some reimbursement to keep that structure in place. So all those good things, why aren't we doing it? And we look at several reasons. These are my reasons, not particularly based on research, but source water protection, SWP, has never been required by the Safe Drinking Water Act. It is encouraged, but there's no regulation saying we will do it. Therefore, a lot of utilities think that it's not necessarily not a necessity and put it on a lower priority. When you think about where you live related to where your water comes from, the vast majority of us don't live in the watershed that provides the water that we drink and use in our daily lives. So there's a disconnect of what happens out in the watershed. How does that affect my water rates, my water supply? That applies to the administration of water utilities as well. They have that same disconnect many times. We are at utilities primarily engineers and accountants, not conservationists and biologists, although a lot of biologists do work in water utilities, but we're not used to doing things like conservation practices. And a lot of times our accounting procedures don't allow us to account for things like conservation easements. How do you put that on your spreadsheet? How do you show that you're getting benefit from this money you're spending in the watershed? So that's a difficulty. Utilities, like everyone else, have restricted funds. So we have to allocate where those funds go. Because of that disconnect with the watershed, a lot of times utilities, and especially since we're run by engineers are reluctant to consider funding the soft practices like riparian buffers, nutrient management, because of the uncertainty of the benefit we get from it, and being more certain of what we get from actually putting in hard practices in place. Because of that, frequently the administration of water utilities will tell the Source Water Protection Fund, go out and get grants to fund your program. And I think when it comes down to it, the main reason we really don't do a lot of the watershed work is that we're just not well networked with the conservation sector. And I'm going to talk a bit about something Arkansas is doing to improve that, but we don't know the right people to work with. All that said is just that collaboration is really the key. And as Scott Simon from Arkansas Nature Conservancy says, when you have good partners, you get good projects and you get good funding. So that's where we're trying to go. So what would you expect then if you were reaching out to your utility? And I put these kind of in what I think would be the order of probability. First is political support. I spent a lot of my time as a source water protection manager writing support letters for grant applications. So, and it is a priority issue, so you probably have a good shot at getting them to support your proposal. If your conservation group and the water utility can come together on a common message, such as riparian buffers are good, then you might be able to work with them. They probably have outreach people on their staff that can work with you on reaching out to the community, on public education, things like that. Water utilities have people monitoring water quality frequently, and at least in some of the larger utilities, there's going to be, or I'd say mid-sized to larger, crews out in the field already monitoring water quality in the watershed. So those crews could easily be tapped as a form of in-kind assistance for a grant proposal, something like that, to meet the match. And probably they have engineers available that can do the watershed modeling that needs to be done to support a watershed program. And utilities might actually get into direct financial assistance to the landowners. Let's talk about each of those just a little bit. Political support, and I think this survey from the Trust for Public Land really says it best. When they look at the different uses of outdoor uses that might take place, protecting water supplies and drinking water always comes out as the thing that most of the public will support in terms of a project or funding mechanism. So you probably will get political support from your utility. When we move on and say a common message, I'll just use this example, Secchi Day on Beaver Lake. In 2006, the Audubon, Arkansas came to us. Of course, they're interested in birds. We're interested in clean water, but they said, we have a common message. We're both interested in clean water. We're both interested in protecting the natural ecosystem. Why don't we get together on a project? And we thought about it for a while, and we finally came up with the Citizen Science Project and borrowed a page from Bob Carson's book and came up with Secchi Day on Beaver Lake, where we have 30 citizen science teams go out on the lake one day in late summer to get water quality data. And we kind of run it like a bass tournament. They come back and they report the results, and we have a crowd that watches and cheers as they come in. But also we have other partners that come here and they have opportunity to present their education message to the public, which we're getting several thousand people or several hundred people a year come out to this event now. So, and we also now have probably 24 partners on this. So a common message is something that really bloomed into a good program to get the message of ecosystem services out. When we think about that technical or in-kind assistance, that just another example, we have a nonprofit group called the Watershed Conservation Resource Center in our area, who specializes in stream restoration work, which is one of the big issues in terms of water quality degradation in our watershed. And we have a Beaver Watershed Alliance, a watershed conservation group. They got together and came to Beaver Water District in 2015 and said, we'd like to do a RCPP project, that's Resource Conservation Partnership Program. And we want to focus on stream restoration, and we'd like for you guys to help us. Okay, well, we jumped on that and said, okay, we'll be on your steering committee. What else do you need? And then we talked about it. Okay, we can provide some in-kind support because we have the monitoring crews to monitor water quality throughout your watershed and show the benefit of the project. We have an outreach group in our staff, and that outreach group has a common message with the people doing the RCP project, so we can cooperate with you on that. Through all of those things, we were able to look at that and say, well, we can provide about $125,000 a year in in-kind services, and we're also willing to pay a certain amount hard match into the stream restoration work. So we got on board with that. But then they needed a public sponsor. Because we're working with multiple landowners, we have to use the PL 566 program, which requires a public sponsor on the program. So finally, we agreed to do that. That's just a 20-year commitment to maintain the facility. Financial assistance, I'm going to try to hurry up here. We haven't jumped directly into direct financial assistance, but we do have a fund that provides sustainable funding to the source water protection. Among other things, we'll use this to help our local land trust with the conservation or the stewardship fund every time they get a conservation easement within our watershed. So we do provide some assistance. And in terms of reaching out then, what should you do? Identify the source of water that the utility uses. That might be in their annual consumer confidence report, or just call them up and ask them. If they probably have a stakeholder group they work with, try to get on that group. If they don't, invite them to your stakeholder group. Find out where your common goals are. Start trying to build a history of working with them, but be realistic in what you're asking. Also, be patient with them. They have their funding cycle, but be persistent. Don't let them forget about you. American Water Works has regional meetings. It would be a good place to start networking. Your state drinking water agency also is a good place to work with. And on all your projects, measure and report the results so they can see what they're buying. Then talking about building those links or networks, this is just something that we did in Arkansas, the Forest and Drinking Water Steering Committee. It's a product of the Southeastern Partnership for Forest and Water. That's a partnership between the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities and the Southeast District of the National Forest Service to try to make these links. They helped us sponsor a forum statewide in 2015 to bring leaders of both of those sectors together to share and learn about each other, to start a conversation, to build our networks, and then to look at where we can go. What we came out of that with was an agreement that we'd keep that dialogue alive. The low-hanging fruit was to start going to each other's conferences and making presentations. The Beaver Watershed Alliance bumped up their forest management program with help from Beaver Water District. Central Arkansas Water, that's Little Rock, started their forest management beyond just holding forest. And then we developed this Arkansas Forest and Drinking Water Steering Committee, which meets 2 or 3 times a year just to keep that conservation alive. So summary then, utilities should protect their sources. There is interest. We get benefit from the natural infrastructure. All of us, or most of us, are going to have partners. So if a conservation group has a common interest, there may be a potential there for collaboration. And with that, I think I've gone over time, so we'll go to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob, for that really great presentation on source water protection and the work that you are doing, or that you have done with the Beaver Water District. So we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions before we move on for the day. So one question for you, Bob, is relating to some of the financing and funding mechanisms. So beyond just grants, what are some of the other options that utilities or nonprofits could think about as it relates to funding source water protection work?
At Beaver Water District, we in 2015 dedicated a fund, 4 cents for every 1,000 gallons we sell, to source water protection, which doesn't sound like much, but that comes out to be about $750,000 that goes to implementing that program. Other utilities have meter fees. They'll charge 25 to 50 cents per meter per month to fund their source water protection program. There are ways of using the state revolving funds, the Clean Water Revolving Fund or the Safe Drinking Water Revolving Fund to fund non-point or source water projects. And usually, like the Clean Water Revolving Fund will give utilities a break on the interest rate if they use part of their money for a watershed type practice. So there's that effort, and then there's the general idea of green bonds, where a bonding group will provide some break on the interest rate to open up to doing natural infrastructure type projects. So there are several opportunities. Some of those are just getting started, and others are fairly well established. There's probably 2 or 3 dozen utilities in the country now that have source water funds that they operate from. And a lot more are looking at that. So that, I think, are the ways that utilities can get more involved in funding.
Great. Quick follow-up on that question for you, Bob. Is there like any information or report that you would be able to share with folks about how revolving funds have been used around the country? Does something like that exist? Or is it just more kind of chatting with folks who work for utilities who have done some of this work in the past?
I don't know right offhand of a report. I know that Todd Gartner at the World Resources Institute has done a lot of work on those alternative funding mechanisms, and has I think he has a report on utilizing revolving funds. I think the Trust for Public Lands may have some studies on how some people have used those, and EPA probably has some case studies where utilities have used revolving loans for source water protection.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we'll end the question and answer session with one last question, which I'm sure this is a kind of complicated answer, so maybe, Bob, you can give us kind of one or two high-level thoughts. But what's kind of the first way to start reaching out to a utility if you're a conservation organization about starting to work together?
I think what I would do would just be to, number one, find out if the utility they're dealing with has a source water protection program, but probably just to make an appointment and go out and talk with the chief executive officer, just a get to know you session, and then start looking where do we have common interests that I could approach these people with to start working cooperatively on a project. I think you would find most of them pretty open to the discussion and also interested in advancing their source water protection program.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bob. So we'll go ahead and stop the Q&A questions from here. I know there are a couple of other questions left in the question box, and I will work with Bob to respond to those questions and get back to all of you. But I wanted to thank everybody for participating in our January webinar, and really I'd love to thank Bob for taking time out of his busy day to chat with all of us about the great work that's happening in Arkansas around source water protection. So thank you all for participating in our January webinar, and stay tuned in the next couple of weeks to hear about the webinar that we'll have in February. I hope everybody has a great rest of their afternoon and a great last couple of days of January. Thank you.